And even though it has magic and all this fantastical stuff, it's so gritty and realistic that you feel like you could go there, and it's something based in reality. And what's it like in Bordertown? Well, since it's fairly lawless, no police, there are gangs and there are bars with music. Music plays a huge role in Bordertown and all of the Bordertown stories and a lot of the other urban fantasy stories. There are a lot of squats, and there's a lot of ways people try to make money. People get clothes, vintage clothing, and they sew it together to make new outfits, and they sell those to high fashion elves who like to slum around a bit. So this also is pretty much similar to what was happening in real life. And again, there is a lot of magic. Now, and the thing is that sometimes the magic in Bordertown works and sometimes it doesn't, because it's in our world. So it's interesting. So every writer who comes to Bordertown to tell their story has their own style and their own perspective, but there are rules that they need to abide by. The names of the streets and the neighborhoods need to stay the same, like the different areas in New York City. You have Soho, the meatpacking district. Those sorts of things stay the same. And north, south, east, west is the same, and there is a river, and it's always kind of in the same area with the same name. The names of the bars and cafes stays the same. There are different clans and groups that keep the same names. But each author can add on. And if another author thinks that was a really cool thing, then it gets kept. So over time, it evolves and moves and changes and morphs with all of these different people participating. And it's also, some parts of it read like a Xeroxed pamphlet. It's some of the books act as if you are newly arrived to Bordertown, and one of the things is there's no information center, there's no internet, there's no Google at the beginning, and so people hand out these pamphlets that tell you in a no-nonsense way how to live in Bordertown, who to talk to, who not to, who to avoid, what neighborhoods to avoid, who's going to be nice to you and help you out, all kinds of fun things like that. It's very, or it's also kind of like a zine, if you know what a zine is. The language is of the 80s. A lot of the world people are very much language that I'm familiar with, because that's the jargon we used at the time, but they also make up Elvish slang that comes into play, so it's really creative in that regard. Okay, now, this had a really nice run. There were many, many books written. If you want, you can get The Essential Bordertown. This is a reprint of several of the stories written in the 1990s. But a lot of the other books are gone now. You could only get them in a used bookstore, which is kind of accurate for the tone of Bordertown. It's definitely a place you have to go. If you want to know, you have to go. You have to hunt, you have to find it and do it that way. However, there were many authors who were influenced by this world, and one of those people is Holly Black. And you probably know Holly Black. She's very popular now, and she's all about fairies and modern fairies and urban fantasy. She was influenced by Bordertown. And she approached Terry Windling and said, I want to remake Bordertown. And so they decided to put more stories together. 13 years had gone by since the last Bordertown book was written. So how were they going to deal with that? Well, they decided that in the story of Bordertown, 13 years had gone by. And the interesting thing is, in our world, okay, 13 years is 13 years. But in the Bordertown, since it's fairy and magical, only 13 days had gone by. And what had happened in that time, it's a fascinating read to read the old with the new, because the language has changed, the jargon has changed, the technology has changed. But some things remain the same. The magic is the same, the grittiness is the same, the DIY aspect of living is still the same. So it's still kind of punk. So I highly recommend that because, and you will also see, this is a tangent, I'm going to go on a tangent, Holly Black, if you want to see clearly the influence of Bordertown on her writing, you can go to her modern fairy tale trilogy. Her first one is called Tithe, and this is a story about a young woman whose mom is in a band. So here the music, the rock and roll aspect is the same, and they live a very unusual life where they just travel all the time, very gritty city lifestyle. So you can see that in this. And this young woman, she doesn't know that she's a changeling. She doesn't know that fairies had taken her mother's actual baby away and put her, a fairy, in its place. And in the story, she starts to go through transformation to discover her true roots. Now, the next one gets new characters. It's called Valiant. And this is about a world child, a real world child, who has a trauma and runs away to New York City, very similar to Bordertown, where she meets up with some gutter punks and starts squatting on the street and discovers the fairies who live in New York City on the street. Very dangerous. The last book in the trilogy brings these characters together in Ironside. And in this story, they all conspire to battle the Seelie Queen who had taken over all of the fairy realm in a very shifty kind of way. And yet, again, it's very much having to do with urban fairy telling. And lastly, and then I'll be done, and thank you so much for listening to all my ramblings, there's another person you probably already know, but if you don't, you should know. His name is Brian Froud, and he is an illustrator of fairies. Famous. He has worked with Jim Henson. He was instrumental in The Dark Crystal. So if you look at The Dark Crystal, all of those sets, all of those puppets were directly from his drawings. He also did all of the drawings for Labyrinth, which is also a very famous Jim Henson film. Great, watch those, they're awesome. And one thing that he did in a similar but a little different way is he drew all of these fairies, all of these drawings, and then he invited his author friends to come to look at all of these drawings to be inspired and to write a fairy story. And the only caveat was that there had to be an environmental message somewhere in the story. And those were Brian Froud's Fairylands. And Charles DeLint wrote one of them. And I'll show you one of his illustrations. Really beautiful. Back cover. Charles DeLint wrote one. He was, and Midori Snyder wrote Hannah's Garden. She is mentioned by Terry Windling many times, Midori Snyder, and she wrote for Bordertown. Patricia McKillip wrote another one, Something Rich and Strange. But Terry Windling was invited to write one for this series. But hers, which started out as a short story, as they all were kind of short, hers grew into an entire novel. And it is wonderful. If you are interested in symbolist art, if you know who Remedios Varo is, the painter, and Frida Kahlo, you might be interested in this book, and it is called Woodwife. And it is a splendid novel that she wrote. You can get that through the library system as well. So that is my story, and I hope that this inspires you to check out any number of these books. And we've got, over 9 books here in this whole world that people don't know much about. So thank you for listening, and that's it.